I was driving home from the feed store when Caleb's phone lit up on the passenger seat. He had forgotten it that morning, which was strange on its own. Caleb never forgot his phone. The screen flashed a preview before going dark again. At the red light, I picked it up. The name at the top of the thread stopped my heart cold. Father Dominic, our priest. The message read, "Hi honey, I'm waiting for you." Cars honked behind me as the light turned green, then red again. I couldn't move. Even before I opened that thread, something in my chest cracked wide open, quietly, slowly, like ice breaking under weight. I knew my life was about to change forever. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat there with shaking hands. What I found in that thread was not a misunderstanding. It was intimate, personal, unmistakable. There were photos of Caleb, my husband's photos, sent willingly with captions I will never repeat. The timestamps told me everything. 7 months. 7 months of late fellowship meetings. 7 months of helping Father Dominic with the church accounts. 7 months of me making dinner for a man living a completely different life behind my back. I didn't cry. I photographed every screen with my own phone, every message, every image. Then I placed Caleb's phone exactly where I found it and drove home. By the time I arrived, Caleb was at the kitchen table eating the stew I had left in the slow cooker. He looked up and smiled, that warm, easy smile I had trusted for 11 years. "Long day, Della?" My name is Della Hargrove, 43 years old, a cattle farmer's wife in rural Crestfield, Ohio, and until that afternoon, I had believed I had a good marriage. "Just tired," I said. I watched him check his phone when he thought I wasn't looking, watched him relax when he saw his messages still there. Unopened, he assumed. He had no idea. In 11 years of farm life, I had learned one rule: never chase a spooked animal. You wait. You plan. Then you close the gate. That Sunday, I sat in the third pew of Crestfield Community Church, exactly as I had every Sunday for 11 years. Father Dominic stood at the pulpit in his white robe, preaching about honesty and commitment in marriage. I watched his hands grip the podium. I watched Caleb bow his head beside me. Twice. Just twice. I caught a flicker of eye contact between them that vanished so fast most people would have missed it. I didn't miss it. After the service, Caleb shook Father Dominic's hand warmly. I smiled at them both. "Wonderful sermon, Father," he smiled back. "Thank you, Della. You're always so kind." I nodded and walked away. Neither of them had any idea what was already in motion. That evening, I sat alone in our bedroom and thought carefully about what I stood to lose. The cattle farm was in both our names. Our savings were joint. Our reputation in Crestfield was built on 11 years of church membership, the same church where Father Dominic had married us. In a small town, the betrayed wife doesn't always win the sympathy. Sometimes she becomes the cautionary tale. If I confronted Caleb in anger, he would deny everything and delete the evidence before I could act. But I had spent 3 years as a volunteer church secretary. I had helped type up the church bylaws myself. I remembered exactly what was buried in Section 9, Clause 4, and I started planning. I told Caleb I was visiting my cousin in Columbus for a few days. He looked relieved. That told me everything. Instead, I drove to the next county and met with a family law attorney named Paulette Osei. I showed her the screenshots. She leaned back slowly. Solid evidence. But we move carefully before he knows you know. She advised me to open a personal bank account, document all farm assets, and gather financial records as a joint owner. I did exactly that over the next 2 days. Then I made a second discovery. Father Dominic was married too. His wife, Carol, lived in a neighboring town with their 2 teenage sons. 2 families sitting in the dark. I decided neither of us should stay there. That week, I reviewed the church's ordained minister moral conduct agreement, the document Father Dominic signed every single year. Section 9, Clause 4 was clear. Any verified act of adultery or sexual misconduct involving a congregation member was grounds for immediate suspension and ethics review by the regional board. 6 years. He had signed it 6 times. The Greater Ohio Regional Board, a 9-person committee with full authority to remove ministers and revoke ordinations, had a formal, confidential complaint process. I printed the form, filled it out carefully, factually, without emotion. Then I attached every piece of evidence I had gathered. The process had a beginning. What happened next was no longer entirely up to me. and that was exactly how I needed it. Sunday came again. I wore my blue dress, the one Caleb always said made me look calm and collected. I volunteered for the early flower arrangement near the altar, which gave me a reason to linger near the church office. As people filed in, I heard Father Dominic through his cracked office door, voice low, tight. "Just a little longer. Things are complicated here." I moved away without being seen. He didn't know I had already emailed the Greater Ohio Regional Board's formal complaint address the night before. Subject line, urgent concern regarding ordained minister, Crestfield Community Church. He stood at the pulpit an hour later and preached with his usual confidence. It would be one of his last sermons. 3 days later, I confronted Caleb. Not in anger, not with shouting. I waited until he was at the kitchen table with his morning coffee, relaxed and unsuspecting. I slid my phone across the table. On the screen, a single screenshot, one of the earliest messages between him and Father Dominic. Caleb's face went completely white. "Della." "Don't," I said quietly. "Don't explain. Not yet." His hands were trembling. "How long have you known?" he whispered. "Long enough to handle this properly." I stood up, refilled my coffee, and went outside to check on the cattle. I left him sitting there with the image on my screen and a silence so heavy it filled the whole house. I requested a private meeting with Father Dominic. Told him I needed pastoral counseling about personal struggles in my marriage. He agreed immediately. Of course he did. We sat in his church office on a Tuesday afternoon. He folded his hands on the desk and gave me his warmest, concerned expression. I let him settle into the role of trusted guide. I answered his questions vaguely for a few minutes, watched him relax. Then I said, "Father Dominic, I think the church deserves honesty. Don't you?" Something shifted in his face. "Of course," he said slowly. "Good, because I've already been in contact with the regional board. They'll be reaching out to you very soon." I stood, thanked him for his time, and walked out without looking back. That evening, I compiled everything into one organized folder. Printed screenshots, every message dated and time-stamped. A written timeline of every late fellowship meeting that now made complete sense. A copy of the moral conduct agreement Father Dominic had signed. Caleb's phone call records, which I could legally access as a joint account holder. A statement from Paulette outlining relevant bylaws and legal standing. Labeled clearly. Organized chronologically. Page numbers added. I sent the complete package digitally and by certified mail to the regional board's official address. I sent a second copy to the National Denominations Oversight Committee. No drama, no emotion, just facts, clean, clear, and completely undeniable. By the time the board opened their email the next morning, the case was already built. The board moved faster than I expected. Within 5 days, Chairwoman Adele Ferris called me directly to confirm receipt. "We take allegations of this nature very seriously, Mrs. Hargrove. A preliminary inquiry has been opened." 2 days later, Father Dominic was placed on administrative leave pending review. The Sunday pulpit was filled by a visiting minister from the next county. People whispered in the parking lot after service. Nobody knew the full story yet, but they all sensed something had cracked open in their community. Something hidden, something that was no longer going to stay quiet. In a small town, that feeling travels like weather. You can't see it coming until it's already arrived and changed everything around you. At home, Caleb moved through the house like a man waiting for a sentence to be handed down. He tried once, carefully, to ask if we could talk things through. "There's a process happening," I told him. "Let it finish." He nodded and walked away. Meanwhile, the community shifted. People at the feed store were quieter around Caleb. A couple who once waved from their truck now just nodded. Crestfield was a small town. Word traveled through it like water through dry ground, fast and invisible, until everything was soaked. That week, the regional board sent formal letters to both Caleb and Father Dominic requesting attendance at a closed-door ethics hearing. The date was set, 3 weeks away. I had been invited to speak. The hearing was held in a meeting room at the regional board offices in Dayton. Long table. 9 board members, 2 lawyers present as observers. Father Dominic arrived in a dark suit, looking pale and older than he had from the pulpit. Caleb sat 2 chairs from him. They didn't look at each other. I had prepared my statement over 2 weeks, Not an outburst, but a clear, factual account of what I had discovered and the documented evidence I had submitted. I spoke for 11 minutes. I did not raise my voice once. When I finished, Chairwoman Ferris asked one follow-up question. Is there anything in your submitted evidence that was unclear? No, I said. I believe it speaks for itself. She nodded. Then she turned to Father Dominic. Is the evidence submitted by Mrs. Hargrove accurate? The room went very still. Father Dominic looked at his hands for a long time. Then he said yes. One word. Barely a whisper. Caleb didn't deny anything either. He sat with his shoulders curved inward, staring at the table like he hoped it might open and swallow him. We appreciate your honesty at this stage, Chairwoman Ferris said to Father Dominic. Her tone was not warm. It will be considered. The hearing continued for 2 more hours as the board worked through documents and procedural questions. Then a vote was called. I sat against the wall with my hands folded in my lap. I had done my part. The rest was exactly where it belonged. Out of my hands. The church issued its formal statement 4 days later. Chairwoman Ferris read it aloud at a special congregational meeting on a Wednesday evening. The hall was packed. After thorough review, the Greater Ohio Regional Board has found Father Dominic Achebe in violation of the Ordained Minister Moral Conduct Agreement. Effective immediately, his ordination is revoked, and he is permanently removed from leadership within this denomination. The silence that followed was absolute. Then murmuring. Then questions. Then, from the back of the room, quiet crying. Carol, Father Dominic's wife, sat 2 rows in front of me. I watched her shoulders go still, then watched them begin to shake. Caleb was not there. I reached forward and put my hand gently on Carol's shoulder. We didn't need to say a single word. The fallout was swift. Father Dominic's revocation became public record, following him to any future ministry position, anywhere in the country. For Caleb, the consequences were different, but just as real. Several farm supply contracts tied to church relationships quietly dissolved. A livestock buyer stopped returning calls. A neighbor chose not to renew our grazing land agreement. Caleb came to me one evening. Desperation in his voice. Della, can we fix this? I looked at him steadily. I already filed for divorce, I said. Paulette filed the papers last week. He sat down heavily. The farm will be handled fairly and legally. That's all I can offer. I walked out of the kitchen and went to bed. Alone, but for the first time in months, completely at peace. 3 weeks later, Caleb moved into his brother's house. He didn't fight the divorce aggressively, maybe because he knew what the evidence looked like, or because some part of him understood he had no moral ground to stand on. Paulette negotiated a fair settlement. My cattle herd stayed with me. Caleb came by one afternoon for the last of his things. He stood by his truck looking at the house. I'm sorry, Della, he said. I know you are. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't closure. Just the truth. The only honest thing he had offered me in a very long time. He drove away. I stood in the yard, listening to the cattle in the field and the birds in the tree line. The farm was quiet, but it was mine. That week, 3 women from the congregation came to see me separately. Bet, a quiet widow in her 50s, brought a casserole dish. I had a feeling something was wrong, she said softly. I just didn't know who to tell. Simone, 29, told me she had felt deeply uncomfortable around Father Dominic during a private prayer session, but hadn't reported it, afraid no one would believe her. Then Carol came. Father Dominic's wife sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours. By the end of it, we had both cried, and both decided we were going to be all right. I realized then, my breaking open had given others permission to speak. That mattered more to me than any legal outcome. By early spring, the story of Crestfield Community Church had fully reversed itself. People stopped me at the hardware store, the diner, the farm supply depot, sometimes just to say, I'm glad someone finally did something. I was no longer the woman whose husband left her for the priest. I was the woman who had quietly, methodically, and without a single public scene, brought 2 men's hidden lives into the light. Father Dominic's wife filed for divorce. Both men quietly left Crestfield. Simone filed a separate formal statement with the regional board. The investigation widened. The 2 men who had relied on the silence of a small community and the trust of the women around them had made a fundamental mistake. They had mistaken my patience for ignorance, my quiet for helplessness. Neither assumption served them well. The divorce was finalized on a gray Thursday morning at the county courthouse. An ordinary day, overcast, a little wind. The kind of morning you wouldn't notice if nothing significant was happening. But everything significant had already happened long before this moment. Both parties in agreement? The judge asked. Yes, I said. Caleb's voice, through his attorney by phone, yes. The judge signed the papers. 11 years of marriage ended in a room that smelled like old carpet and fresh coffee. Paulette shook my hand outside. You handled this with more grace than most people are capable of. I thanked her and drove home, stopping at the farm equipment dealer on the way because spring planting was coming and there was work to do. I put the farmhouse on the market in April. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life in a house that felt like evidence. I found a smaller property 8 miles east. 12 acres. A good barn. A creek along the back fence line. My sister Nora flew in from Charlotte to help me move. She spent the first day unpacking and the second making me eat proper meals and laugh at old stories. One evening on the new porch, she said, that man had no idea who he was living with. I looked out at the creek. No, I said. He really didn't. That was the last time I felt any bitterness. After that, it simply became a closed chapter. By summer, both men had vanished from Crestfield's daily life. Caleb took a job out of state, Indiana, from what I heard. He kept a low profile and did not reach out. Father Dominic's revocation had been reported in the denomination's national newsletter. Every church in the network knew his name. His attempt to secure a position at a small Pennsylvania congregation was declined. Simone's separate statement had widened the board's investigation. More women came forward. The pattern hidden for years was now fully visible. The two men who had relied on silence, the assumption that small-town loyalty would protect their secret, had been exactly wrong. What protected them was never the community. It was me, and I had simply stopped. By October, my new farm was running well. 12 cattle, 8 from the settlement, and 4 new ones I had sourced myself. Back fence repaired. A part-time farmhand named Olu, quiet, hard-working, always on time. On Sundays, I found a small congregation in the next town. They met in a converted barn. The pastor was a woman who preached without drama and shook everyone's hand at the door. I didn't go searching for faith. I just found it one morning in a folding chair, with hay in the air and winter light through the high windows. It felt honest. After everything I had walked through, honesty was the only thing I still trusted completely, and it turned out to be the most solid ground I had ever stood on. Sometimes I sit on the porch and think back to that gas station parking lot. Phone in my hand, a message on a screen meant for someone else. Hi, honey, I'm waiting for you. They were waiting for secrecy, for me to fall apart and give them a scene that shifted the focus onto me. They expected me to be too heartbroken to think, too humiliated to act, too alone to fight. What they forgot. I had spent 11 years running a cattle farm. I knew how to be patient, I knew when to move, and I knew how to close a gate. I didn't destroy them out of rage. I stopped protecting them with my silence. What I got back, more than the farm, more than my name, was my self-respect. That was more than enough.